After 8 long years, this Liberal government and its war on the Canadian middle class is finally being realized. Inflation is up, house prices are up, the debt is up, bankruptcies are up. Canadians are visiting food banks in record numbers. 300,000 of them went in a single month in Toronto. 1 million more Canadians will visit a food bank next year than this year. They are joining Facebook groups to learn how to dumpster dive so they can feed their families. What's happening today is a far cry from the Canada that we used to know, from the Canada that many of us were promised. Canadians are asking why. Why does food cost more and more every single time you visit the grocery store? Why does gas cost $2 a litre? Why is it harder and harder to pay the bills at the end of every month? Well, at the root of this complex problem is a simple explanation in just 2 words, in fact. These words are the carbon tax. The Prime Minister's carbon tax is adding more to the cost of nearly every basic necessity that anyone in this country buys anywhere. It's not complicated for Canadians. When you tax the farmer that grows the food and you tax the trucker that brings the food, you end up taxing the family that eats the food. Every single family, everywhere in the country. It is, however, a difficult concept for Liberals and their NDP masters to comprehend. It's because they don't talk to people anymore. You see, the MPs who are being forced to defend the indefensible over there are just about pulling their hair out right now. If you listen to them, they'll jump down your throat and huff and puff and spout misinformation about rebates and money that you're getting back. But, Mr. Speaker, they're using Liberal math. It's Liberal math that says an Ontario family that pays $1,674 gets back $1,047. And they'd say they're better off. It's Liberal math that says the Albertan who pays $2,943 and gets back $2,032 is better off. It's Liberal math, like some bizarre fantasy telling Canadians that less is more and they are somehow better off. This is the same Liberal math that tells Canadians that budgets will balance themselves, that monetary policy isn't important, and that $60 million for ArriveScan is some kind of accounting error. Mr. Speaker, Canadians don't live in Liberal land. They live in the real world. They look at their empty fridges at home. They look at the price of gas at the pumps. They don't do Liberal math. They do real math. The real math is getting harder and harder every day as budgets and bank accounts and borrowing are stretched to the limit. For everyone, everywhere. They used to talk about the environment until the caucus revolt from his East Coast MPs, the Prime Minister's East Coast MPs, that forced him to admit that his tax was a tax and that it was too much, and then he backed down from his signature fake environmental policy. And he gave them what they wanted until, of course, the next election. The radical Minister of the Environment had a different takeaway yesterday. He told Canadians that we can't put climate change on hold. And I agree with him. Which is why it is so infuriating to see this carbon tax used under the guise of somehow improving Canada's environmental performance. After 8 years of this Prime Minister, we rank 62nd out of 67 countries when it comes to climate performance. The Environment Minister could have scaled more floors on the side of a tower than 62 by now. The only emissions target we ever met was during COVID, when the government shut everything down in this country. Our taxes are up, our costs are up, and our emissions are going up. So if the carbon tax doesn't give Canadians more money and it doesn't help the environment, then what are they doing here? Well, we know, and Canadians are finding out too, it makes the Prime Minister richer. More money flowing into the pockets of his Liberal coffers. There it could be funneled to insiders and his well-connected friends. Those are the only people in this country that are better off after 8 years. It means more money to spend on high-priced consultants, more money to spend on trips around the world, and yes, more money to somehow make an $80,000 app $60 million. Madam Speaker, we all know this, the true cost, the true impact, and yes, the true intention of the carbon tax. It really seems like a sick joke that this Prime Minister would choose to raise it once again. And it's not just by a little. It's by a whopping 23% on all Canadian families, on farmers, on First Nations, in less than 2 weeks. And it's not just because the tax is being raised, it's because it costs so much to achieve so little, and that's the story of this government. And it's because it comes probably at the worst time for Canadians in a long, long time, probably since we had a prime minister with the same last name as this one. 51% of Canadians are less than $200 away from bankruptcy, and a 23% increase means they're even closer, probably $200 more every year for the average family. More money flowing out of the wallet and not back into it. It's even more money at the pump, at the grocery store, and at the bills at the end of every month. It's a kick to Canadians that are already down, and it's no surprise that 70% of Canadians and 70% of premiers, including Liberal premiers, and even more opposition parties across the country oppose this increase. It's because they all know what we know. This tax isn't worth the cost, and neither is this Prime Minister. The Prime Minister says that these Canadians and these premiers just don't have principles. But he's got it all wrong. They have something that he has never understood. They have bills to pay, they have mouths to feed, and they have to get to work every day. I have some advice for the Prime Minister through you, Madam Speaker, and I say this to everyone else saying that things are wrong. Maybe it's time for him to finally look in the mirror instead of blaming everyone and everything else. We have been here for nearly 2 years. Conservatives have tried everything to force this government to listen to Canadians, but they just don't care. The Canadian people are tired of being taxed to death. They are tired of runaway inflation and runaway spending, and they are tired of being told it's all their fault. They deserve a say in this 23% tax increase. So today, this motion of non-confidence in this Prime Minister will allow every Canadian to go to the polls in a carbon tax election and have their say. It is the only right thing to do when Canadians have been pushed so far to the limit after 8 years of this Prime Minister. It is the only right thing to do when the increase literally means the difference between solvency and bankruptcy for so many. And this Liberal government, if they're so confident in their carbon tax and so confident that that everybody else is wrong, then they shouldn't be afraid to let Canadians have their say. Let Canadians weigh in. And if the Liberal NDP members from Atlantic Canada, rural Canada, and frankly any part of Canada truly represent their constituents, then they would have the guts to stand up and vote against their boss today. It is long past time to axe the tax. And time is absolutely running out for Canadians right across the country, no matter where you live. But, Mr. Speaker, there is hope. There's hope on the horizon for a government led by the Leader of the Opposition. And Canadians will finally get their say in a carbon tax election. If they choose to vote with the Prime Minister today, we will eventually have a carbon tax election in this country, and Canadians will have a choice. They will have a choice between a Liberal government that divides to conquer and taxes to spend, bolstered by an even more reckless NDP that only exists to say yes to everything that the Prime Minister demands. Right. Or they can have a party that will finally axe the tax and build the homes and fix the budget and stop the crime. I'll support this motion because we should let Canadians decide.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Yes, Madam Speaker, there are fundamental flaws in terms of what it is that people have just heard from the Deputy Leader of the Conservative Party. And that is that it spreads a lot of myths that are out there. For example, Madam Speaker, the member is trying to give the false impression. The reality is over 80% of Canadians will receive more back in the form of a rebate than they are actually paying for a carbon tax. She knows that. Those are real dollar figures, disposable income going up. Why does the Conservative Party want to continue to intentionally mislead Canadians? Do they really think they're that stupid?
Great question.
Honourable Member for Thornhill.
Mr. Speaker, you know when you're yelling at the top of your lungs about mistruths that you're not winning the argument. And as the Prime Minister said yesterday, if you're explaining, you're losing. But here's the facts from the Parliamentary Budget Officer. Nova Scotia family, fiscal and economic cost, the gross cost of it, $1,500. The rebate that they get back, $963. That's the difference of $573. Now, we know that the Liberals don't understand that $1,500 is bigger than $963. But do they understand that when a family gets $573 less money, that they are worse off?
Yeah. Exactly. Questions and comments? L'honorable député de Abitibi.
The Honourable Member for Abitibi, Baie James Nunavik EU. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for her speech. But I'd like to specify something. The Conservatives are saying that people are lining up at food banks and that riots are breaking out when food is distributed because of the carbon tax, which doesn't apply in Quebec, by the way. But perhaps instead they should say to the oil and gas companies, rather, that they should get involved in the green transition.
Thornhill.
Madam Speaker, to suggest here that the carbon tax doesn't apply in Quebec, there is a second carbon tax in Quebec that raises the price of gas by 17 cents a litre. That's going to raise the cost of everything that gas transports, from the farm to the grocery store to the table. To suggest that that doesn't have an effect, to suggest that the member believes that people eating at food banks has nothing to do with the carbon tax, well, I don't know. I don't think I can help her.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member Timmins, James Bay.
Thank you. Well, it is an extraordinary thing to say we are going to force an election that will cost $630 million. And I do agree with my honourable colleague. He says about a leader needing the guts to stand up. Now, on Monday night, the leader of the Conservative Party voted 9 times in a confidence motion to support the government, but he did it hiding behind the curtain on a night when we had the historic vote on peace in the Middle East and Gaza. He has a tendency to be missing in action when it means time to stand up. So I'm on to ask my honourable colleague, I couldn't get an answer from the member for Dairy Queen, but tonight, if he's willing to take the government down, will he actually stand up and be in the House, or will he be off with his lobbyist chief of staff and her lobbyist friends drinking canapes and getting backhanders?
It is always in order to talk about the competency or the incompetency of members of this House, and particularly that member for Timmins. And if he bothered to show up in his riding, he would know what the people in his riding are saying. But he doesn't do that. He doesn't go there. He doesn't listen to anyone. The only person that he listens to is his boss, the Prime Minister.
We have time for a brief question. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for Employment and Workforce Development.
Madam Speaker, when the Conservatives were in power, my community in Windsor had an unemployment rate of 11.2% unemployment. Under the Conservatives, Canada lost 300,000 manufacturing jobs. Can the honourable colleague speak to the incompetence of the Conservatives in terms of job creation? Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Thornhill, a brief answer.
Madam Speaker, if that member had the courage to vote with his constituency, then he would hear them loud and clear talk about the incompetency of his own Prime Minister.